Hall, live from the mall in Washington, D.C. And first, we want to take you aboard the historic train ride with President-elect Obama.
So this is back to the inauguration train taking Obama from Philadelphia to Washington. All the broadcasters had a problem to transmit live from the train. Watch here and see what happens. This is a live transmission as recorded a few months ago.
Well, Tamron, right now we are not moving. We're all of the press here. We're in a revamped cafe car. For those familiar with Amtrak, it's where they have all the press. We're holed up waiting for the president-elect to get on the train so we can get moving and get on our way to Wilmington. And in this trek that he's going to be doing, he's going to be slowing down about halfway between Philadelphia and Wilmington and waving sort of impromptu waves to the crowd from the train. Obviously, we'll all see it. I want to tell you a little bit about the technology we're using. It's something called Live View. It's all cellular technology. In fact, that's how we're covering the president. It's this new technology. We don't need satellites anymore. We can use cellular phones. The stuff we're using today is basically a combination of 6 cellular phones to bring this to you. There's a little bit of delay, but it does allow us to get to places we would.
Good. So that's the NBC chief correspondent to the White House, an interesting one. And then I said, let's see here. Yeah, this is also about taking live broadcasts to the internet. So for the very few of you who do not read the daily newspaper Kikar HaShabbat, I just got this yesterday from my friend Menachem David Lazar, who is running a Live View value-added reseller. And so that's a nice example of how you democratize content and video broadcasting. The Haredi community here in Israel has begun to use Live View for drashot, for the wedding transmissions, for mitzvahs, and so on. Think about the ramifications and implications on the YouTube generation, having the capability to transmit live from everywhere to anywhere. So those were just a few examples. I think we're going to skip this one. And let's go to a conversation. Can we get some lights here, please? Anybody in charge of lights? They fell asleep, I guess. So, okay, we may find a light somehow. Dan, I want to ask a question. So, we are going now back quite a few years ago. You're a senior vice president at MasterCard. You get a phone call from this headhunter about this very small, tiny Israeli company named Deal Time, which has about 8 employees, right? What did you have in your mind? What made you leave this comfortable, nice position at MasterCard, being basically on top of the world, and join a tiny little startup out of Israel, of all places, and go around that company?
Well, you have to remember it was 1998, and as we all know, the internet was going to change everything. In fact, it actually did, but it took a little longer than we thought. So I really felt like I had just turned 40 years old. As you can tell, I've got a few years here. I just turned 40 years old and decided that, that now was the time. I'd been talking to a lot of different folks about a lot of different internet opportunities, and happened to in the end, meet up with a wonderful human being who unfortunately has passed away last month in a tragic plane crash, Nachum Scharfman. And Nachum was the one who really persuaded me to join this brand new startup. And so I did that in January '99, and I was absolutely convinced that again, this is '99, going into 2000, height of the bubble. I was convinced that we were going to have an IPO in a year. And in fact, we did file for an IPO in March of 2000 with a whopping $500,000 of revenue. Those were interesting days, as those of you who remember them can attest to. So that's really what happened.
So how does it feel like to run an Israeli company? I believe that you were based in the East Coast at first. You have your R&D center here in Israel. Obviously, we Israelis know everything much better than you do overseas. How did you overcome the cultural gaps, the technical differences, the geographical time zone differences? How do you go about all this?
Well, we had the R&D presence in Israel. All our engineering staff were based in Israel. And we set up the business headquarters initially in Connecticut, which is where I live. and then later on in New York, which is a short distance away, about 20 miles away. And that actually worked pretty well. You have to remember, of course, shopping.com is a consumer-facing, was and is a consumer-facing site. It worked pretty well initially. What started to happen is that we found that we needed to have much more interaction on the product side in particular. And when I say product side, I mean the front end, UI, and the things that went into that. We needed to have a lot more interaction than we necessarily had. So long story short, we ended up keeping the back end in Israel and the product catalog in Israel, and then moved the front end over to the US.
As opposed to investors, people like us who don't do anything. Wow, many people. How many of you are still running your own companies? Good, that means all of you. How many of you think that you will ever need to enhance your management team with US-based executives? How many of you have already done this? Zach, okay. You're all for all of it, thank you. By the way, Zach has an exciting company named Reimage. Those of you who have not voted, this is SMS number 1. Am I allowed to do free propaganda here? I'm not an investor, so I can. Did I say anything wrong? Where did the lights go? You can keep them on. So how many of you think those entrepreneurs who are still running their companies that you will ever need to replace yourselves with a US-based CEO, and if so, why? Could you elaborate on that? Can you go to that microphone over there and tell us, because that's an interesting one.
One.
Okay, so what is your name?
My name is Ilan Peleg.
Ilan, so the question to Ilan is, why do you think that you are going to, sometime in the future, consider replacing yourself with a US-based CEO, or European-based for that matter?
I'm the inventor of Web 4.0. So it's too big for Israeli market, even for development. I may do the very first alpha here in Israel, but as soon as beta, I need a US-based customer.
Good. How are you going to go about recruiting a new CEO from abroad?
Well, I'm just going to talk with Dan, but I've already sent some emails to some major bankers in New York.
Well, let me just, one thing I want to emphasize. I don't particularly think that people here need to have a U.S. CEO if you're in the U.S. market. I do think you need a U.S. presence, for sure, but you don't necessarily need a U.S. CEO. So I want to make that
Well,
point.
wait, that's a nice one.
Yeah.
I think that deserves an applause. You do not think we need US-based CEOs, we are good enough. Come on, guys.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I think there's a huge amount of talent, leadership talent in Israel, and I don't think that it requires, if you're based in the U.S. and that's the main market, you have to have a presence there, but it doesn't mean you have to have a U.S. CEO. And I do think, frankly, that's a mistake that a lot of companies made, particularly in the bubble, where, you know, we're in the U.S., we have to get a U.S. CEO. It's not about getting a U.S. CEO, it's about getting a CEO, period. And, you know, if you feel like you have what it takes to be a great CEO or can get there pretty quickly, that's great. If not, look for the right CEO, whether they're Israeli, U.S., or Mongolian. As long as they have what it takes to be the right CEO, that's really what you need. And again, you need the U.S. presence, particularly on the product and marketing side, if that's your market, or European presence, if that's your market.